Two Kinds of Teachers is a short video that focuses on my experience as a pre-service teacher, involving inclusive teaching practices and their subsequent effects on students. It combines not only my practical experiences throughout all my placement settings, but an in-depth analysis of the theories I've learnt in EPE 310 and in my collaborative learning experiences. Sadie was the kind of girl who would make you smile. When she laughed, it was contagious, and when she smiled, her eyes would light up. She had a quiet disposition, yet a deep strength about her. Sadie was in her first term of Year 1 at a local inner suburban Adelaide school. She is an Indigenous student who speaks both Indigenous Creole as well as a very basic standard Aboriginal English. For Sadie, life hadn't been easy. She was born into a loving family, but one who battled the effects of drug and alcohol. Sadie was an only child and only had recollections of her mother and father from when she was young, as she had grown up with her grandparents. Last year, when Sadie and her grandparents arrived in Adelaide, she was in Mrs. Hunt's reception class in this suburban school in northern Adelaide. Although a very experienced teacher, Mrs. Hunt struggled to relate to Sadie and found her difficult to manage. When discussing her progress with a colleague after Sadie's first term of reception, Mrs. Hunt reported, "She is impossible to work with. She refuses to speak, respond to verbal instruction, and appears disorientated and disengaged with any work that I present her. Furthermore, she's disruptive to others for most of the instructional time. I have 30 other children in my class and a few others with very challenging behaviour. I'm at capacity and really don't know what to do with her. To be honest with you, I think she's downright disrespectful and needs to be pulled into line. I haven't been trained to manage a student like her." To manage Sadie during class time, Mrs. Hunt employed an additional needs approach in her aim to be inclusive and chose to focus teaching activities around Sadie's needs rather than the class as a whole. Not only did this cause Sadie to feel a great deal of humiliation, but her classmates began treating her differently and teasing her. Mrs. Hunt adhered to normalisation theories in that there was an expectation that Sadie would conform to a particular mould expected of her and that any deviation was contrary to what was required. In her teaching approaches, there was an underlying assumption that Sadie was expected to adapt and compete in what was an unfair environment with little awareness of her unique needs. This attitude has its roots in neoliberalism, which has had a significant impact in the field of education and the subsequent ramifications on social justice and inclusion. Neoliberalism brought with it a competitiveness that's not only economically driven, but one that has filtered down to the classroom in terms of labelling students like Sadie according to her academic achievement and her ability to earn economically. These undue pressures on academic and financial achievement have had negative effects on education, leading to the notion of the ideal student who will add value to the educational setting, and therefore subsequent devaluing of those students such as Sadie who may be viewed as difficult or too hard. In Year 1, Sadie was placed in Mrs. Tang's class with some new children whom she hadn't played with before, and thankfully things took a turn for the better. Over the course of a few weeks, Mrs. Tang's inclusive teaching approach began to show in the way Sadie blossomed. At the heart of Mrs. Tang's inclusive pedagogy was increasing access and participation for all students in her class and decreasing exclusion by ensuring respect, equality and collective belonging, which she believed were essential to human dignity and basic human rights. She employed numerous creative approaches such as initiative work and made sure she built strong, close relationships with each student to learn and understand their identified unique needs. Mrs. Tang carefully considered these differences between learners and accommodated them through the variety of activities and tasks that were made available to all, reducing the negative ramifications of highlighting some students such as only Sadie as being different or concluding what learning might be possible. Mrs. Tang also ensured that she requested for upcoming professional development days, particularly to do with Indigenous education, to make sure she was aware about Sadie's specific needs. Her teaching pedagogies were also supported by the two-way educational approach. which acknowledges that students develop both knowledge of their first culture and language, as well as the culture and language of the dominant society. Subsequently, Mrs. Tang identified ways in which Sadie's Indigenous culture could be included and drawn upon during class time. And she recognised that this would not only have positive outcomes for Sadie, but also for her grandparents. Although there are numerous complexities involved in establishing inclusive pedagogical approaches, Mrs. Tang provides a sound example to emulate, and one that I have been fortunate to have experienced and learnt from.